to do today. Okay. Okay. Thank you. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell a set of stories about Institute Park. They're in some rough chronological order. They don't go in any particular order of priority. But a work that was very meaningful to me as a young environmental historian and landscape historian was a work by David Mining, who suggested that we can always look at a landscape, a frame view, and find many different layers of meaning in it. And so I want to walk us through few that we'll see at Institute Park as it's evolved over the age, and also what that kind of means to the way we see it now. Okay?
I'm pressing the wrong thing.
No, I'm not, Harriet. I can't. It's locked. Oh, how do you move it? Any key? Okay.
Space key.
Okay. All right, I'll just do the space key.
There you go.
You got it working here?
There you go.
All right.
Yay.
Her allowance is generous. Okay, so I'm going to tell a set of stories, and they're not going to be in any particular order. But in choosing those stories I'm telling, I'm also not going to be telling stories. And I want to recognize that there is a wealth of stories that simply exceed the parameters of what I could do in the time I have available to us. So I am not going to talk about the history of the Nipmuc people and the way they used the lands of what the English would call Worcester County and then establish a town here. And so I want to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge this is the historic territory and the unceded lands of the Nipmuc people. And that we are living and we are working and we are playing on these lands. And that this is a common thing I'm doing right now that is increasingly done by a host of organizations and universities, because we're recognizing the ways in which we live upon land that had been seized in a variety of ways, not all of which were legal, okay? And the particular acknowledgement I borrowed here, I've taken from Holy Cross, which has an official land acknowledgement on their website, and WPI, the institution I'm at, is currently thinking about adding one to the way in which we do our business and think about our position in this landscape and our position in relationship to stories that we don't normally tell, or we elide, or like me, just say that has to be another time. Property, that's going to be my first story. Because in this world, when the English arrive in central Massachusetts, they bring with them particular ideas of property, particular ideas that's marked by the power of mapping and metes and bounds, measured distances, and stone walls. The idea of property is the idea that you could take land and use it exclusively, that it becomes the owner's land, and they could limit other uses, or they could sell some of the uses of the land that they possess. And this stood in stark contrast to the way in which the Nipmuc people used the land, who had notions of userfront or use rights, whereby no one owned, they only had use rights that were temporary, shifting, and ultimately mobile, as their cultures were as well. In thinking about property, I also want us to think about the ways before Salisbury Pond was dug. Salisbury Pond is not a natural feature. This was originally part of the Salisbury family farm after Stephen Salisbury I moved to Worcester in the late 18th century. And it was established as part of a large set of land holdings that his family would have until the late 19th century, when his last surviving heir, Stephen Salisbury III, starts to use those lands to endow institutions across Worcester because it was a source of the family wealth. His father had already started this practice, but this property then becomes a form of wealth, wealth that could be used to establish other things. And for Stephen Salisbury II, it was a means of acquiring power, and power that we can think of both as metaphorical and quite literally. When Stephen Salisbury II looked over the landscape that he saw, that was formerly his father's pasture lands, he saw power. Okay, he saw the ability of the Mill Brook that ran through what is now Institute Park to facilitate the industrial expansion of Worcester. And he seized upon this opportunity. And what he does in 1834, he dams Mill Brook to establish Salisbury Pond. He also has a portion of the western section of the pond dug, so that the pond is about 12 feet deep overall, okay? And he does this specifically to sell the mill power that could be taken from the falling waters out of this. There are two primary, and that's the purpose of this particular map, is to show us the two primary sites. The first set of mills would be the Grove Street mills, but then we'll also see coming out of, in two parts, Salisbury Pond is water that is going down to the court mills. Okay? So he turned this piece of pasture into an engine. And in turning it into an engine, he earned himself both wealth from the leases that he enjoyed from Ichabod Washburn. Ichabod Washburn would enter into an agreement with Stephen Salisbury II to draw on the mill rights at the foot of Institute Park. And this was the original Washburn Mill Wire Works. And Ichabod Washburn, who becomes one of the great industrialists of the early 19th century in Worcester, comes upon an idea and a set of patents at a fortuitous moment. He originally starts working in wire at the suggestion of a Boston piano maker, Josiah Chickering. He's desperate to have wire that's not imported that he could use in his pianos. And this becomes the foundation then for Ichabod to develop wire drawing technology. This is around 1834. We know in 1848, of course, that Samuel F.B. Morse wonders the question, what God hath wrought? And wire becomes one of the crucial ingredients of the industrial expansion of the United States. It's going to become a major component of telecommunication networks, or the telegraph, and later telephony. Okay? It will also be a key way in which the western lands, which are grasslands without any meat trees, could then be further divided into property and controlled by those who own them by enclosing them, no longer with stone or wooden fence, but with barbed wires that will facilitate the transformation of the American West, not only from Indian territory again, but also the range of the bison and into a land where increasingly we see cattle that will stream back across the country, and we'll come back to that idea of cattle in cars. So I just want us to think about what's been transformed for a minute. We had native land become English property, become water power that could be drawn into wire, and a host of other manufactured goods in Worcester that can aid in the industrial expansion, not just of the city, but of the country and the enclosure of its western territories. One thing I want to point out as I tell this story is at this point, the landscape of the park itself looked very different. In a way, oh, I skipped one. That's the one I wanted. We are now familiar with a large causeway that was built as the Central Artery project in Worcester in the 1950s. So up until the 1950s, the water spilling out of Salisbury Pond was almost coming right up to the structure itself, okay? And so a large chunk of Salisbury Pond is actually buried under the parking lots and some of the other structures in front of the mill now. So we don't have this view of the park anymore. And this is just to show you another way of seeing the narrow road that stood in front between the mill building of Washburn and Salisbury Pond. Cool. Mill power was only one of the pieces, one of the sources of wealth that the Salisbury family could draw from the pond that they had dug. The other was ice. And as the pond was finished being dug and the first winters come, Stephen Salisbury II enters into a set of agreements and leases that eventually are held by the coal and ice merchant Benjamin Walker. And Benjamin Walker, as he does on several other ponds across Worcester, would erect an ice house. And every season, the Worcester ice house would harvest ice from the pond, store it in a mostly cork-lined structure to help insulate it and keep it cold. And then this ice was transported as its own commodity, often over great distances. And now we can go back to those cattle, because once railroad and refrigeration cars become available in the 1876, it's ice, like from these ponds, that eventually provide much of the refrigerant along with ammonia to keep processed meat cool, changing the way in which people would eat across the country. This is one other way in which this would be shaped at Institute Park. And I don't want us to lose sense of the transformative power of cool, right? Since I don't possess any myself, I like to think about it in the landscape. And here is just another image of the ice house, obviously, at another part of the season. And I show this because the ice house stood to 1901, to July 4th, actually, when workers at the Washburn and Moen wire works were celebrating the 4th of July, set off fireworks, hit this as a building of cork. It would never be rebuilt. And it's actually on the spit of land where the fire department's headquarters are on Grove Street. We'll come back to that part of the story in a minute. The pastoral. And here we come to the park, right? Kind of what we think. Through all this first half of the talk, or first part of the talk, we've been thinking, it's not quite halfway, I'm sorry. I don't want to give you false promises. Through all this, we've been thinking about the park as property and the rights and wealth that can attribute it from it. In 1887, Stephen Salisbury III, the heir to Stephen Salisbury II and his only surviving adult child, donates the land to the city to become a park. And at this moment, the park, the lands around Salisbury Ponds, become a public good. Okay? And that's a significant transformation. And we want to think about why Salisbury III took this step. What was his motivations? And what also did he remain in control of? Okay? So when he gives the gift to the city, right, which is in 1887, and it's the letter's dated a couple of days before, and it's published in the Worcester Daily Telegram, and it's a complete deed of gift to the city. And it will tell us why he does it, the terms of the gift, okay, and other elements, a piece of that. And here, I want us to remember Washburn and Moen, The factory that started as Washburn Wire Works grew into the enormous industrial facility at the foot, and that was also now surrounded by other mills, some of which his own father had built from power drawn off Salisbury Pond. Okay. When Stephen Salisbury III saw this, he grew concerned. He wondered, during the past 10 years, Worcester has changed materially in appearance and has lost much of the rural aspect, which long after it became a city, gave a charm to the streets and continued to offer refreshment and cheer to its inhabitants. The gardens and grounds formerly surrounding many of our homes have been divided into house lots and are now occupied by structures which have little more land about them than is required for their actual use. Such changes are now taking place with increasing rapidity, and the time is near at hand when most of our citizens can have the enjoyment of little of the verdure and shrubbery around their dwellings. It was the lament of the loss of greenery, the loss of nature within the city, and the sense of pastoral charm that it gives to a surrounding area. Stephen Salisbury had been working with Edward Winslow Lincoln, who was the first park commissioner and was instrumental in the establishment of Elm Park and the creation of a broader park system for the city. In fact, Stephen Salisbury III served on the committee that produced the 1886, plan for parks and recreational spaces across Worcester. And this is probably what prompted his thinking as well. He was also thinking of the Institute, or Polytechnic Institute, which his father had donated the original land upon which it sits. And he was recognizing the increasing value of the Institute to the county and the surrounding areas of New England as a training ground for the future manufacturing entrepreneurs. And he wanted to ensure that the Institute had space in which to enjoy the city. And within the original deed of gift, recognizing this, he instructs the city that it's to be called Institute Park in recognition of the value that WPI gives to the city. And he also gives WPI a claim to the park. And he allows for a clause for WPI to claim land in a portion of the park to build a structure of an attractive facade within 20 years. So within this park, he's also imagining that it might be instrumental to the evolution of WPI itself. And indeed, now it really very is, and we'll get to that part of the story later, right? But if we go on in the deed of gift, right, we also recognize that he's not giving up the power or the cool, right? Those two things he holds on to. And so while the land around the pond is given over and recreational uses of the pond can be enjoyed, he maintains that the water has to be maintained at certain levels and not to be drawn off for other uses, because that water is serving industrial purposes and is property. That part of the pond remains of value as a commercial piece. Within a short period of time, and probably even before Salisbury established the park formally, the park had become a gathering point, especially at the noon hour when the factories around it released workers for a break. And this is a report from the 1890 Park Commissioner's report. And it explains to us this scene, right? The sort of value of a park and what it is to the people, right? Because parks are about people, right? And that's the thing I want to keep reminding us. As soon as the park became a public good, right? It came about the uses to which the people would put it. And the higher ways in which it could elevate and form bonds between the people. Okay? Salisbury not only gave the land that the park surround, in 1892, he also made available $50,000 to construct many of the initial features that would be a part of the park, from the paths to a boathouse and a bandstand, to the picnic pavilions, to a sanitarium, and to a ruin not unlike that at Bancroft Tower. I don't understand why, but Stephen Salisbury III had a folly, right? He had a passion for folly. This Norse tower, which was erected at 30 feet, okay, was to offer something important, right? Remember the word I started with, which was pastoral, okay? Key to this, and key to the vision of Stephen Salisbury III and Stephen Earle, the Worcester architect who he commissions to aid him in making improvements to the park, have an idea that they're building scenery, that they're giving space for the Worcester residents, those who work, and those who don't, to sort of enjoy a remnant of rural pastoral life that they had without, right? And the purpose of this wasn't just because he liked greenery, but he also believed with others in the 19th century that parks were essential to social functioning, right? Andrew Jackson Downing, the father of American landscape architecture, in his famous book of 1848 would say, "Take my word for it. Parks will be better preachers of temperance than temperance societies, better refiners of national manners than dancing schools, and better promoters of general good feeling than any lectures on the philosophy of happiness." Okay? And that was a piece of it, right? The park was also about social uplift, kind of creating social harmony and trying to create a space which is so essential to cities for social cohesion, but also a sense of purpose and shared order, right? The idea was that the parks would serve as something of a social safety valve, right? Of a rapidly urbanizing industrial society with rising levels of wealth inequality, at least we had parks where people could use the spaces and enjoy the scenery and experience its beneficial influences to uplift and to cohere, right? And to bring order. Frederick Law Olmsted would make the same point as he's building Central Park in New York, that the purpose of bringing pastoral landscapes, like the one that Salisbury is at work in building at Institute Park, was to inspire communal feeling among all urban classes, muting resentments over disparities of wealth and fashion. Those are Olmsted's words, okay? He thought, Olmsted did, that the scenery would, in his words, calm the rough elements of the city and also divert men from unwholesome, vicious, destructive methods and habits of seeking recreation, right? So we can see the way there is this vision. But it also, right, and this is an important piece, it also offered relief for urban workers and urban residents whose exhausted bodies and probably frayed nerves would be refreshed, right, and renewed by regular contemplation of framed scenery, okay? Now I want to go back to the pastoral and walk us through the park as it probably existed at its, I don't want to say its most beautiful moment, but a moment of intense kind of beauty, right? Here's the Norse Tower, the ruin, right? The structure that Salisbury III built to give a sense of kind of purpose or history to the space. And I want to show you the purpose. If you look all the way up, you can see some heads poking out over the top. This was to offer the prospect. This was the space where the entire scene could be framed from, right? And in keeping with the exhibit on today, we know that Worcester residents came to the landscape with an idea of drawing scenery, of thinking about scenery in the words that famous poets and authors and painters were sort of setting the patterns for, whether in the Hudson River School or Sarah Josepha Hale's fiction. Right? And here we can see, I just have to point this out, there's WPI, there's North Tower itself, right? It would also become a place to parade, right? To walk, to take in the scenery. And this was also a crucial functioning of these. We had the rough and tumble play of, 1890 from the Park Commissioner's report, but we also had the fashionable promenade right along the water's path. And if you didn't think I was being serious when I said before about this being used to offer a prospect, we have our heads again. It was also a place to pursue other forms of leisure. The paths were open to bicycles, to horses, and at the dawn of the motor age cars. Salisbury also, along with Stephen Earle, constructed a bridge that connected the island in Institute Pond to the area of the park over by Rumford Street, right? Stephen Earle constructed this in the style of Richardson, right? It actually looks very much like a bridge that Richardson had built earlier in the 1880s on the Boston Fens. And we can see the way, not perfectly laid out, but this was cleared. This was also created as a landscape for people to seek shade, seating, and rest. The park and the improvements that he would do would go on to provide conveyances to enjoy the pond itself and to paddle upon the water, first with an early swan boat, and later with a fully provided for boathouse, so that the workers of the 1890s no longer had to seek out a boat. There were several available for the pleasure, right? And again, we could see the Queen Anne style in shingle patterning, which is very significant around the areas of Elm Park. And we all can also see the construction of the first bandstand and the benches for the taking in of scenery, right? We see the park mature, and with these component pieces, occupying a central place within the city that perhaps serve the functions that Andrew Jackson Downing, Frederick Law Olmsted, and Salisbury and Edward Winslow Lincoln thought it would. Sorry, like my pictures. This was an electric car that E.B. Luce, the famed Worcester photographer, business photographer, had done in Institute Park, because as soon as park cars became available, riders started to go through Institute Park, and no sooner had cars become available than Worcester drivers got unbearable. So in 1908, they closed the park to traffic. And here we see the finished park that was originally imagined by Salisbury, the pastoral, and all the senses of purpose that it could be provided for. It provided a frame, right? That's what a landscape is, a frame. And that frame could be broken and used in other ways, right? People have choice in how they use space, but there was consciousness about how it would be used. There was also considerable thought placed into the trees that would become a part of the park. The area around Millbrook that eventually becomes Salisbury Pond, and the lands around Salisbury Pond had been used as pasture. So they weren't wooded lands. And so thought went into the selection of the urban canopy. And in the late end of the 19th century, and the words on this slide, lungs of the city, are Frederick Law Olmsted's. He saw parks and the trees amongst them, providing something essential. Olmsted would say, 1 million people, when he was talking about New York, 1 million people will soon be crowded on this island. And if these lungs of the city are not furnished, instead of the healthiest, this will become a sickly place, right? The idea or the relationship between environment and health, sort of an environmentalist, right? That environment matters not only to the health of people, but as we saw earlier, their social well-being, right? Their moral integrity within this. And so I show these trees newly planted over on the west side of the park with Park Avenue behind it. And I could just tell you, you can go back and you can actually identify the trees that were planted in Institute Park, many that grew up first in the nursery that was across at Elm Park in order to provide tree cover for many of the neighborhoods of the city. And we're reminded of this today when we walk Institute Park, not only because the city forester and the Worcester Tree Initiative and now Tower Hill take an active role in maintaining our urban forests for many different reasons, but also because the historic stand of birch trees that were planted at the turn of the 20th century still stand. There's a centennial grove of birch opposite the First Baptist Church. And it's beautiful grove of trees. It's right by my office. But I want to remind us that this remained an industrial city. Right? The pastoral was an image. It was trying to balance, right? It wasn't trying to displace. And so even in many of the views that were made popular, and these are all a selection of postcards from the Worcester Historical Museum, you can see the prominence of place to which the greenery, right, to the pastoralism of the park is given prominent place, right? So now, the machine, yeah, there we go, is in the garden. We need to remind ourselves, that's still a machine. But the idea was that you can balance industrialization. You could produce social cohesion among a city of increasing numbers of immigrants living in more densely packed conditions through the creation of spaces for the public good, right? And we want to keep that in mind. Uh-oh. I might have run out of battery. I hit my climax.
Is all this progress while they're still delivering power?
Yeah.
And water?
Yeah. Well, the water is still, it's got it. And that my battery's died. Yes. Although water power is used by the 1890s is going down, but water is still being used in Washburn moments as part of its steam power operations. And it is also providing flow to water for other industrial facilities in there. The other industrial use of power we will get to in a moment, right? And that is water is both a source of power, but it's also a sink for the effluent that you create or the pollution that you want to rid yourself of. And the pond and the moving waters into it and out of it provided that sink. And so the industrial uses of water, thank you, honey, are many. Great, thank you. Oh, we now have these beautiful, that's okay, we'll stick with them, right? I just want to finish one point before I move on again. Oh man, I gotta move. This is 1911 now. And one of the things we will notice here is At the death of Stephen Salisbury III, he donates significant portions of land to the Worcester Art Museum. Eventually, the Worcester Art Museum in 1912 donates portions of this land to the city of Worcester to expand Institute's Park onto the spit of land where the ice house was and where the fire headquarters now is, and where McConnell Fields is. And then also point out, and I'd be remiss if I didn't remind us that when the North High was still on Salisbury Street, and when the Vogue School was still operating, these were playing fields for the school. So generations of Worcester residents, that was their ball field. That's where they practiced after school sports. Culture. This I'm going to do a little fast, but I'm sorry. The thing is, Salisbury helped create the vision of the park. And in the 20th century, as the challenges that the 20th century produced, many other people stepped in to give the park new purpose. In 1951, Henry Levinson, who was director of what is now known as the Worcester Symphony Orchestra, founded the summer concert series that still continues in Institute Park. Right, in its first years within the park, it would attract large audiences, over 1,000, okay? And it provided a new purpose to the park. But the scenery remained, and we can see the advance of the tree cover, right? And we know that the concert series has now celebrated its 70th year as a continuing institution, enjoying a new band shell in 2014, and others. But this is the part I wanted to get to very much, ecology. And I want to teleport us to 1970, right? Because who doesn't enjoy talking about the 1970s? It was, I know you weren't born yet, Bill. So, it is at this moment that we start to see increasing concern about the ecology of the pond itself and what lies at its bottom, right? And in 1970, the editorial writer of the Telegram and Gazette, Robert Nemeth, would remark, "This year again, spring has been silent on Salisbury Pond," famously evoking Rachel Carson's 1962 classic. He's also doing it in 1970, which is the year that Earth Day is both celebrated as a grassroots movement bubbling up from within communities and sort of an activity that Gaylord Nelson has given a stamp of approval and a staff to help coordinate across local communities in the United States, right? And so we do see the rise of individuals who live around the park taking serious measure of what Institute Park has become in Salisbury Ponds. Here are two individuals really significant to this piece of the story, Charles Pepper and Frank Norden, who will establish the Salisbury Pond Task Force in the 1970s, right? And here you could just see them taking in the scene. It kind of evokes for me, for those of you who remember that kind of National Ad Council crying Native American, just looking at what once we saw as scenery, a collapse into ecological mess. The park becomes the site of Earth Day cleanups of schools and colleges. Don't have to show you right? And of course, there are some who would just as soon pave it over or turn it into more playing fields. But the Salisbury Pond Task Force, which will eventually change, and because this problem will exist, will also produce the Millbrook Task Force and then the Blackstone Headwaters Project. But I want to tell you why, right? I pointed out one way, right? The way in which before the rise of the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act and its serious enforcement, much industrial effluent was emptied into nearby water bodies or land, within this. And so whatever water came into Institute Park was including things coming out of the tailpipe of local facilities, okay? And I want to point out a couple of other changes. And this will just help us think about how Worcester changes in the 20th century. This is the 1939 map, right? And I want to point out a few things, right? Here's Indian Lake, which we're all familiar with. Here's Weasel Brook, right? And you'll see that Weasel Brook moves through a very swampy area, okay? That's important. And we'll also see there's Marshall Pond, okay? And everybody looks at me and like, there's not a pond there. And you're right, there's not a pond there. And there's Salisbury Park. What had once happened was water coming from Weasel Brook would sort of settle in the marshy area, which had great grasses, reducing the sedimentation in the water still streaming. It would come and get deposited in Marshall Ponds. But in the 1950s and 60s, Marshall Pond is drained. It's turned into industrial real estate. And Weasel Brook, and much of this is also paved over, as we can see here, in the 1974 map. Okay, Weasel Brook is still there. Now, Marshall Pond isn't, but Weasel Brook is now flowing mostly underground in culverts and eventually emptying into Salisbury Pond here. Right? So Salisbury Pond is still getting fed by Millbrook, now Weasel Brook and Kendrick Brook that fed Weasel. Yeah, there's this maze of little brooks, right? But what happens is that you no longer have that marshland, you no longer have Marshall Pond. So any effluent and sediment coming down Weasel Brook is now heading right into Salisbury Pond. And this is the 1983 topographical map. And since you're not my students, I'll just point out, instead of asking what's different, 190 has been constructed. 190, along with much of the development on Gold Star Boulevard, which is where Marshall Pond and Weasel Brook is now under, sends additional runoff, right, and stormwater down into the channels and the culverts, carrying additional sediment, accruing additional materials that are accidentally or unpurposely disposed of, and settling them at the bottom of Salisbury Pond. This is a map that we created to give us a sense of how Salisbury Pond becomes a resting place for this, right? And the sort of moral of the story, right, is the way in which Salisbury Pond becomes a really good place to think about the environmental impacts of post-World War II growth, right? And the way in which the changes in landscape use, both the creation of industrial parks and the creation of highways, impact the land that had existed there before. And we know that this was concern to the city. I can go through long lists of spills that eventually end up in Institute Pond at various points. My favorite is the thing that makes the cream and Oreos white, right? I have the name of that here, but I'm just gonna tell this really quickly. There's a tanker car full of it on the rail behind what is presently Home Depot, and someone opens the valve on this. This is also the chemical that gives us liquid paper. And so think about your Oreos in that way. And I'm not directing that at my daughter. And they open the valve, it goes down into the culvert, it comes out and it creates a milky plume in Salisbury Pond, okay? When they're building what is Home Depot, right? They also are taking a cement pan using industrial chemicals, and they're just washing the industrial chemicals into the storm drains. So because of that, Institute Pond ends up smelling orange at some point in time, right? And this still can happen because of the way this has worked, although the Friends of Institute Park and other improvements are making waves. But we can see the ways in which Worcester is connected through its water, right? And that is a good thing, but it's a thing that has to be protected. And we have to remind ourselves of, especially when it's buried underground. WPI gets involved in this story. Students start to become an important part and help to understand and inventory the pollution problems and the sources of pollution in the pond. Students create reports. And here's an aerial view of the park from 1972. And really the concern we have here is right here. Right, this is where the culvert is that is emptying in Institute Park. These studies eventually lead to many different measures. There is an effort to dredge Salisbury Pond of some of its sediment. The initial plan is to remove a great deal of sediment, and the Navy Seabees eventually arrive in 1974 because of the hard work of the Salisbury Pond Task Force that I mentioned earlier. And they're only to remove a portion of the contaminated sediment before they start. And from this moment on, continuous studies and reports in the newspaper remind us of the series of threats to Institute Pond, which is still part of an industrial landscape, even as it remains a pastoral garden. Okay? And in a way, this is good. In 2004, a host of planning gets underway to think about the future of the park and to create the patterns for the Friends of Institute Park and the collaboration of WPI with the park. And this creates many of the improvements that we now see and are going to be more fully realized over the course of the next couple of months, when an elevated walkway is commemorated that will lead to a memorial to fallen fighters. There will also be the improved McConnell Field, which will bring more people together, right? These are, rather than thinking of them as undermining the park, they're making the park valuable. They remind us of how the city works, and they provide us the new kinds of spaces that bring people together. And that's what McConnell Field, who's named after a coach from Worcester Tech School when it was on Grove Street. Right? And I'm not going to do this part, but WPI used to do a rope pull, and WPI students still sometimes swim in the pond. It's when the pond isn't doing the work of temperance societies. Okay. One thing I'll point out, and this is one of the big changes, and WPI's a part and an institution supporting the Friends of Institute Park, is our footprint is growing. And one of the elements is WPI owns the Salisbury Terraces now. We plan to take a portion of those down and build a larger dormitory. And we have already built a larger dormitory on the site of an old envelope factory on Faraday Street. And we also have our biology and life sciences center. So the park, and we also now have a manufacturing research facility on Sagamore Street where this white box is. So the park is, becoming a piece of the WPI landscape. And the entire WPI landscape is structured around a fountain now at its center. And this is the new view, right? If you stand at the center of WPI's campus and look down the now closed West Street, you would see the spot where the old Norse Tower stood and where now the 2014 Cyberman Pavilion now stands, that the Friends of Institute Park had helped dedicate to a family who donated money to support the creation of a band shell for the Concert in the Park series. Students often joke that we're going to take our rights and try and build in the park. But I also remind of this, and this is the note I want to close on, and I'm sorry my enthusiasm for this topic has taken me longer than I ever should have gone. But parks, remember, are about people. In the end, parks become successful or not because of the way in which people use them and not because of the way people design them. And I think that over this period of time, even as Salisbury Pond suffered its hardships, Institute Park was put to new uses. Worcester would use Worcester's LGBTQ plus community in 1992 would begin using Institute Park for a Relaunch Pride Festival. And the Pride Festival will remain there for some time. The festival would start at City Hall and then march down Main Street and up Institute until it set up for a series of programs that the Worcester Historical Museum, as part of a long project that it's still engaged with, are collecting the artifacts from these events and telling them as a fuller version of Worcester's history. We also can appreciate the way in which the park is being used by a host of groups arriving in Worcester and celebrating their culture and reminding us that they're making a home in a city that the park hadn't imagined would be. And these are scenes from the Worcester Caribbean Festival, which from 2002 until the more recent present has continuously played out on Institute Park and now takes advantage of the new band shell. And up until this year, Institute Park was also the sometimes home for the Black Heritage Festival's Juneteenth celebration, right? These are valuable events, though they happen sporadically, though they're not every day, right? They remind us that parks are palaces of the people. They're the spaces where we come together to participate in a shared culture and define the city we live in and set the goals for the city we want to live in. And that's exactly what Stephen Salisbury did. That's exactly what the Levinsons did. That's exactly what the Salisbury Pond Task Force is. The Friends of Institute Park have done it more recently, and now we await, right, to see what the people make of the park as it reopens and is rededicated, and hopefully achieves great things as it had set out to do and achieved in the past. Okay? I will shut up.
Thank you.
I know I have overstayed my welcome. And I appreciate that you didn't start putting your books in your backpacks, which is how my students tell me it's time to stop. I like a good story.
What was the thinking behind moving the pillars from each side of the park to that location?
Okay. Nope. Oh, I could just say, all the stories I just told will become part of a digital history website. So these photos will be available. This is something I've been at work with my students over a couple of different seasons of. We stopped work on it so we could help the museum on a couple of different projects, but this project will once live here. Many of these stories will be told collectively there. The columns come from the Tremont House in Boston and were transported to Worcester in 1895. They originally sat at each end of the park to mark the two entrances in the park. And part of the planning that unfolded after 2004 was to create a new plaza and entry into the park. And someone else might remind me, but the idea was to give a central entry and an identity point to the park right at the foot of Boynton Street. And that brought them together. I don't know, was there another reason?
That was it.
Okay.
Really to create a gateway into the park. One of those columns had a sphere, the other one didn't have a sphere at the top. We then created the sphere, so had that manufactured so that it looked uniform. And that was the thinking.
Where did the first sphere come from?
That's the mystery that no one knows the answer to.
I got asked that the other day and I was just like,
Maybe Gilman's, you came from Webber and a company in Worcester, Massachusetts, and had equipment to turn the table up and the perfect speaker.
mm-hmm,
And there was only one at the outset, only one of us.
okay. You could send me that in an email, right? Okay,
Everything with faces.
okay, I'll ask someday. Yes, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just wondering what folks know of any planned renovations or anything coming up in the next 5 to 10 years for the park?
Yes. We just found out a couple of days ago that a forebay is going to be placed in Salisbury Pond. Forebay is a continual water purifier. And it will be a $2 million investment by the city to start to depollute Salisbury Pond. So great news, just recently.
It hasn't appeared in the news, in the paper
Not
yet.
yet,
Okay,
not yet.
I heard rumors and
We just found out.
congratulations.
Bing.
Yes,
Is it Salisbury Pond or Institute Pond?
it's Salisbury Pond at Institute Park.
Okay. Because I kept hearing Institute Pond and I thought, all right,
That might just been me in my head.
makes sense.
Joe, there's a question from online. Who currently owns the water rights to the pond?
Oh, I don't know. Does anybody?
I think they're shared by the city and according to this.
Pretty much the city, there's a new department now that oversees
Stormwater.
water. It's called the Department of Sustainability.
Yeah. Okay. Does to get the hours. Yes,
The elevated walkway in the dedication, is there a date of when that will happen?
the last I heard, the city was still trying to establish a date. Paul Levinson of the Friends of Institute Park, it's a long time ago.
On Sunday, October 24th at 2:30 p.m. That's what we did dedication on the field and the new firefighters memorial monument and the elevated walkway.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Just one other question
Oh.
from online. Is this so much well knowledge here? Was the pond actually drained in 1970?
Yes. 1974, when the Seabees came, the pond was drained in order to facilitate an initial dredging of it. They had, and I'd have to go back to my notes, but I believe the number was 200,000 cubic feet were supposed to be removed from the floor of Institute Pond, Salisbury Pond, and only 50,000 cubic feet were removed.
And one last question from online. When did the swans come?
Oh, all right, can you move this? Because I have the answer. Well, I kind of partially have the answer. Because I knew this question was coming.
Ah.
And I found this at the Worcester Public Library, and unfortunately, this was a clipping that didn't have a date, so I'm working on dating it. Right?
There's also some swans at Patch Pond.
Mhm.
You know, just.
Yeah, by Worcester State. And so they were brought in with the idea to be a weed control before they themselves became a weed. Sorry, that was judgmental. Any other questions? Yes.
I think that it's controversy about, you know, Highland Street and you know, the high school authority.
Mhm.
Obviously, been built. But is there efforts from this group to make sure more trees are planted, kind of keep developing the walkway and everything, as much as they salvage?
I believe there is. I can't speak to the exact plans, although I read the paper. I haven't been keeping up with it. I was among those that were really surprised when so many of the historic beech trees on Highland Street were taken down. And so I would imagine that the plan is to maintain, because there is the Friends of Newton Hill, like the Friends of Institute Park, that have actively engaged in cleaning up and making improvements in Newton Hill as well, and encouraging its use in various ways. So I think that is something we'd have to ask the city about its particular plans, but that will remain parkland. I mean, there is within Worcester, going back to the late 50s and the 60s and into the 70s, there was several of Worcester's parks had land taken from them for city purposes, or there were designs to use portions of parks for purposes different from that which they were intended. One famous example at Institute Pond was the placement of the fire station there. Doherty was also built upon parkland, and for a time, and John Anderson might be able to help me answer this question, there was an idea of placing alternative use in parts of Greenville Park, which led to the founding of the Regional Environmental Council.
I think at one point that's true, but Regional Park was, part of it was taken for I-29.
And I-290, okay.
Yes.
Right. And so there's a question of, like, this is our park legacy. I'll go back to the refrain of the paper, parks are for the people, and we have to think about their preservation as assets, just as we do historic structures like the one we're in, which is part of the park too. Yes.
And sometimes I was a little bit involved in Newton Square Rotary that's been replanted. Myself and another woman got well, but I've done nothing. She's done everything. Her name is Paula Bushy, by the way, if you drive by there. She does all the landscaping. We got the tree initiative, we got the money, and just volunteers helping and doing that. The city was an accident there this summer, and the city put, new cement there and everything. So sometimes it's just some volunteers in different neighborhoods that can get involved with the initiative or someplace that you can make more greenery in the city, even in the city common.
Right.
So.
And I think that's really true. And I think that's shown in so many of our parks, is that the people, their parks aren't just for the people are their best stewards and their greatest advocates. And that's what keeps the Worcester Park tradition so strong, from the East-West trails to the many different friends of the park, this park spirit. We could have reflected, or we could pull out some of the pieces of the story I told to illustrate that, like the Salisbury Pond Task Force, the Blackstone Headwaters Project, the Millbrook Task Force, the Friends of Institute Park. At one point, one of the picnic shelters improvements or reconstruction was an Eagle Scout project. And so there are stories about how people care for the park, maintain them, and can expand their value. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the park is becoming part of, WPI.
No, it's not becoming part of WPI, but it's like we are impinging on.
The Salisbury Gardens. Residents. And off of that walkway, the elevated, there's a pathway that's paved or whatever. Is that going to extend around the park and campus? Again,
I'm a historian and I live uncomfortably in the present. And so that would be my guess, is that as changes are made, Salisbury Terrace wasn't always used to house students, or it was just used for a time to house graduate students. But as our undergraduate student population at WPI has increased, so has our use of Salisbury Estates to house undergraduates. And we do have anticipation. And before the pandemic, we unleashed an initial report that we were going to move towards building a dormitory there.
Right, I was gonna follow up, any idea, I know it was delayed, when they're gonna break ground on that?
I haven't seen any, what,
February,
February?
on the new door.
Really? Ooh.
In Salisbury Gardens.
Salisbury Estates.
There's
There's a lot of demo.
Thank you for coming, Paul.
Thank you again, and all our sponsors, if you have time, I want to look at the artwork for a little while, I mean, please, we have cookies and water, just please take them.
Question.
Yeah.
For everybody, because they want the interest. Frederick Homestead was landscape.
Yes.